Welcome back to Revere House Radio. I'm your host, Tegan Kehoe, and this episode is one of a couple that we're doing this season on other sites related to Paul Revere's Midnight Ride. And today, my guest is Nikki Stewart of Old North Illuminated. Welcome to the show, Nikki.
Thanks for having me.
To start off, for listeners who have not visited or haven't visited in a while, can you tell us a bit about Old North Church and your organization?
Well, first of all, a common sentiment that I hear when I tell people where I work is, oh, Old North Church, that's fantastic. I went there in 5th grade. Mm-hmm. And then this person might have gray hair. So I know a lot of listeners haven't been to Old North in a while. And over the last few years, really since the pandemic, we've gone through, I think, a really significant transformation in our on-site interpretation and our educational programming. Because Old North Church is a historic site that is most known for 1 minute in time, and maybe less, but we'll say a minute in 300 years of history. And so there is so much more to offer. And in the spring of 2022, we hired a research fellow, Dr. Jamie Crumley from the University of Utah, to spend a year in our archives researching Black and Indigenous congregants and their stories. And that has really led to, again, a reinvention, I would say, of our interpretation and programming that has been incorporated into all that we do. And we've also really begun to focus on accessibility as well. And so, for example, our new exhibit can be enjoyed through audio files. We have large print available. This year, we'll be installing 3 accessibility ramps across the campus to make it easier to get around.
That's great.
And so I think it'll be very different from when you were at Old North Church in 5th grade.
That's great. And can you tell me a bit about yourself? How long have you been at Old North Illuminated, and what was the path that led you there?
I have been at Old North Illuminated since June of 2020. And at the time, I considered that to be nearing the end of the pandemic. And so, my first year or two did not unfold at all the way I thought they would.
Right. Rough time to start a new position.
Yeah. But, I now have experienced what I guess we could call normal years and normal seasons of tourism at Old North as well. And in terms of what brought me here, I have always been a history lover, and somebody recently asked me, well, when did that begin? What got you interested in history? I really couldn't remember a time that I wasn't, but I do remember reading my grandparents' encyclopedias and grilling my grandfather on what his experience in World War II was like, and things like that. So it's always been an interest, but professionally, I had been doing fundraising in youth serving and human services organizations, and had started the Hub History podcast with my husband. Now, I was only on that for a few years, and it is still going strong. But fortunately, this opportunity came along to make the jump into public history, and I was fortunate to be able to do that.
That's great. And I think that outside of these two worlds, the kind of human services and things like museums might seem very far apart. And in practice, I think that there's a lot of both values and just logistics that are pretty similar between the two worlds.
Yeah, I was thinking that through. And to your point, if you were to look at my resume, you would say, oh, youth music, and then early education and history, but all of the organizations have been hubs of community in one way or another. And I think that's the thread that we find between human services and social justice work and public history. They're points of community.
Yeah, that's great. And as of recording, we're still a few months away from the 250th anniversary of the Midnight Ride. So what's on your mind as we head towards April?
There is so much on my mind as we head towards April. There are first and foremost a lot of logistical things on my mind. So we are welcoming Ken Burns as our Third Lantern Award honoree on April 16th. And then we are doing a free and open to the public table read of our original play, Revolution's Edge, on the night of the 18th. The Congregation of Old North also has an event coming up on the night of the 18th as well. And so there's a lot to do there. But I think we're also just weighing on the significance of the milestones and the significance of the milestone at this particular time. And when we started planning for April, well over a year ago, we knew that no matter what happened politically, with the election, that we would be in a divided time. And in fact, we are. And when I think about particularly the play Revolution's Edge and, the really humanizing aspects of that. So it's set on the afternoon of April 18th, just, hours before the lantern signal. It is a conversation between ultimately 3 fathers who are concerned about the future of their families. And they are fathers who have endured great loss, lost a child, lost a wife. Cato, who is an enslaved man, is afraid that he will lose his wife and child through separation. And in fact, that is what happens. And I think there are so many people with those same concerns today. And I think that weighs on us heavily.
Yeah, absolutely. And can you tell us more about the creation and the process of that play? Was it something that you had commissioned or that was developed at Old North or some combination?
So the play was commissioned by Old North Illuminated and written by Patrick Gabridge of Plays in Place, who have Patrick himself and Plays in Place broadly have been wonderful partners, and they are really experts on bringing historic sites to life through theater. And we originally started working together on this play to commemorate the 300th anniversary of the founding of the church, which happened in 2023. And we asked him to create a play that had the perspectives of a loyalist, a patriot, and a person of color. And that was really all that we asked of him. And so he came up with this beautiful 45-minute production of Mather Byles, who had been the rector of the church leading up to the day of the lantern signals, Captain John Pulling Jr., who is a vestryman and one of the lantern holders, and again, Cato, a man who was enslaved by the Byles family. And Byles is getting ready to leave the church. He has either resigned or been fired, depending on who you ask. And I think what's surprising to visitors or to audiences for the play is that Old North was a very divided community. It wasn't a patriot church. We always say, about a third loyalist, a third patriot, a third people who don't want to talk about politics at Thanksgiving. Very much like today. And so it really is a dialogue that helps you see how even in times of great division, there are these 3 men who have connections. 2 of them at times have been very good friends, and they're struggling with, what they think is best for their families.
Yeah. And can you tell us a bit about how the church was positioned in the landscape of churches in the Revolution? I think I encounter the assumption sometimes that a Church of England church in Boston must have been a loyalist church, but you were describing it as having a pretty similar political composition to the political composition of Boston as a whole at the time. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah. So I think, first of all, what's important to understand about Old North Church in its beginnings is that from those earliest years, the congregation throughout the 18th century is very racially diverse. And there was a period, I forget the exact dates, when Old North had more baptisms for Black and Indigenous congregants than any other church in the city. And I think it's important to understand that in a context of segregation and white supremacy, because it did not mean that this racially diverse congregation was seen as a congregation of equals. It did not mean that.
Right.
And we know that Black and Indigenous congregants worshiped in the gallery. We know that they were at times given communion from the king's silver, which, on the one hand is like, well, that's amazing and that feels very progressive. But of course, it was after all of the white congregants were given communion. And, we talk about these things not to besmirch the church, but to recognize the context of the time and, the reality of people's experiences. So by the time of the Revolution, it's very, very much, as I said, a congregation of 2/3. And Old North's wealthier congregants had a lot of connections to the maritime industries. And so we think the policies of port closure and things like that were impacting trade could have moved a lot of the congregants from the loyalist side of the spectrum to the patriot. You know, we always say that people were loyalists until they weren't. And I will say, when I say we, I mean my colleague Emily Spence says that. I'm not gonna plagiarize her. That is an Emily quote, but it's so true. You know, it is a Church of England congregation. The king is the head of church and country. You do not get more loyalists than that to start. But people also are driven by their own safety and security and economic concerns, just as we are today, right? I mean, everybody's talking about the cost of eggs, but at that time, they're talking about the cost of imports and, you know, tax and tariffs and things like that. I suppose that never changes, but certainly that shaped the identity of the congregation.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Oh, I do want to backtrack a little bit to something you said early on in terms of upcoming events. You mentioned a Lantern Award and Ken Burns. Can you tell us more about what that is and what's happening there?
So every year since the bicentennial, Old North has presented the Third Lantern Award.
Okay.
And the significance is that when President Ford attended a service and ceremony at Old North for the bicentennial, he presented Old North with what he called the Third Lantern. And it is a lantern to guide the nation into its third century.
Okay.
So the award has been presented for quite some time now, and it's really presented to individuals who we believe embody the values of the lanterns. You know, hope and courage and teamwork and tenacity and all of these good things. And so I think in this milestone year, there really is no better person than Ken Burns, who has done so much to connect the present with the past and to bring history to people in a way that is really entertaining and accessible and yet at the same time true.
Right.
And I'm really excited for his American Revolution film that's going to come out this October. So that event will be on April 16th in the morning. And then on the 18th, just 2 days later, the Friday, there will be lots of events taking place across the North End and Charlestown, you know, including programming you all are doing here at the Revere House and the programs I mentioned at Old North earlier. And so I think it is a day that history lovers are going to want to look at these organizations, see what's going on, and come into town.
Yeah, certainly.
Particularly to see Revere take his row across the river, which I was able to do during the Roe commemoration, I think in 2014, quite some time ago now. I do remember it was very cold, and so people are going to want to dress for the weather.
Right.
But it is powerful to see these things unfold and to think about what they mean for past, present, and future.
Yeah, absolutely. And this Roe commemoration that's happening on the night of the 18th is an event that has happened in the past, but it's been over a decade, so it's a great opportunity to see this again. I know that you, as the executive director of Old North Illuminated, and Nina Zaneri, the executive director of the Paul Revere House, talk probably at least once a day some weeks. Without, you know, spilling any secrets, can you tell us a little bit about what the heads of two history nonprofits that are 2 blocks away from each other talk about?
Yeah, I would say there are 3 buckets. I think there, you know, first and foremost is real strategy and partnership. I think particularly going into this anniversary period, we've been very intentional that we want to do it together. We don't want to compete. We want to make sure we're all like achieving the same goals and on the same team. And I think Nina has been a fantastic partner, and, you know, a little bit of a mentor and a tutor as well. But then, of course, we also complain about our facilities woes because we both have them, and woes might even be underselling it. And then, you know, there's a little bit of gossip as well, because how could there not be? We are humans, and that's what we do.
Yep. I've been at the Paul Revere House for about 1.5 years, and the number of times that I have gone to a colleague or gone to Nina with is this a known issue when it comes to a facilities woe? You know, like, oh, the heat isn't working, or oh, that's not supposed to leak, are just, part and parcel with being both historic buildings and buildings open to the public. And there's just a lot that happens here.
I think what would surprise people who don't work in historic sites of this nature is how much of a sensory experience it is. So like you could walk into, I would imagine, the Paul Revere house just like you could Old North Church, and you would say, oh, it smells different today. Uh-oh. It sounds different. It's just, you can sense it. Mm-hmm. Something's off today. What's going on?
Yeah, definitely. So at the Paul Revere house, we sometimes get visitors who ask things like, was this his actual house? Or this is all a replica, right? And of course, to us, it's clear, you wouldn't be able to tell something was off by the smell if it were all a replica. But the answer isn't as simple as they expect, because it was absolutely his real house. But also there have been changes and renovations over the years. Mm-hmm. And so I imagine that you get similar questions.
Absolutely.
Can you tell us about the history of the fabric of the building and what's original to the period?
Yeah, so there's so much to unpack there. Mm-hmm. The first thing that comes to mind for me when I think about the question of what's original is the steeple. Because that is, I would say, the most iconic piece of the church, and it is not original. The first one blew down in the Great Gale of Boston in 1804, and then Hurricane Carol took the second steeple down in 1954. And so we have the third steeple today.
Okay.
And it is a copy of the original. And even then I know our staff feel very strongly, do we say copy, do we say replica, like what's the language there, because it means different things. But it looks today as it did in the beginning, although even then the steeple wasn't constructed in 1723. It took a few years, I think at least a decade, for the steeple to be constructed. So we also remind people that while this is a 300-year-old building, things come and go. And so we have artifacts that came in, let's say later in the 18th century, in the early 19th century, but they're still super historic.
Right.
Our oldest known artifacts predate the church by about 100 years. So we have 4 wooden cherubs that flank the organ. They were donated by Captain Grucci in 1743. And visitors love to hear about them because it evokes the conversation of pirate versus privateer and, how they came to be. So that's a very, I'm not going to give away that story. You're going to have to come to the church to get that one. But they were carved in, we think, the 1620s in Belgium. Now, they have been restored a few times. So Are they original? I think so. But are some of those fingers and toes new? Yes, some of them are.
Yeah. And I'm reminded of how at the Paul Revere house, visitors will often ask if something is original, but what they really want to know is, was it here when Paul Revere was here?
Right.
And he bought the Paul Revere house 90 years after it was built. So the answer to those two questions can be quite different.
Paul Revere himself is not original to the Paul Revere house.
Correct. Correct.
One thing we do have going on now that speaks to this question is the restoration of some very early decorative painting in the church. So I mentioned that the church did not always see itself as a historic site. And so decorative painting began in the church in the late 1720s. So these angel murals that we are restoring now were painted beginning in 1727 and into the 1730s.
Okay.
But it seems like for a long time, every generation or two, they would add to the decoration because more funding became available, an opportunity, the style of the period changed. And also congregants who purchased pews were able to decorate them themselves. And so the church, for its first 200 years, was very richly decorated. Rich is maybe a word, garish at times, there's a lot going on. And so in 1912, as part of a major restoration, the sanctuary was whitewashed. And we don't know exactly why, but everything was covered over. And so we have been really excited to reclaim these angels and also to restore them in advance of the anniversary. Because as we tell people, that's a glimpse of Old North as Paul Revere would have seen it and as the lantern bearers would have seen it. I think it's very hard to restore a building like Old North Church or the Paul Revere House to a particular moment in time. It's maybe almost impossible, but we can tie major elements to various moments in time through the building's history.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like that idea of, as certain people would have seen it. And I think that people coming to Boston or in Boston expect a whitewashed church, but that's not the Anglican and not the time period.
Exactly.
Yeah. This brings me to another question that I wanted to ask, which is that Boston has a number of churches that are historic sites and a variety of ways that dual identity is handled. And when you're speaking in the past, you're speaking about Old North Church, but then when you're speaking in the present, there's kind of two organizations coexisting. Can you tell us a bit about Old North Church as a church and its relationship with Old North Illuminated?
Yeah, so Old North Church is, as a congregation, formally known as Christ Church in the city of Boston. And the church is constructed in 1723. And at the very end of 1723, they hold their first service right after Christmas. So it is the oldest standing church building in the city. And it is a congregation that was founded essentially to be like a spillover from King's Chapel. That was a Church of England parish in a very congregational city. And so Old North, even though it was a congregation with a lot of wealth and privilege, they were also a minority. And I think that has shaped its identity, at least in those early times. And I think it's important to consider that it's this, momentous historic site to us today. But for much of the church's history, it's a house of worship and a community, and it evolved and responded to its own needs. And so we always say that it's right after the publishing of Longfellow's poem, Paul Revere's Ride, that tourism begins at Old North and then really expands over time. And so today, Old North Illuminated is an independent nonprofit, and we manage education, visitor operations, tourism, preservation, those types of things. So we are operating a museum and a church, and Christ Church is operating a church in a museum. And so we have a strong partnership. And, we're also part of National Parks of Boston. We're part of the Freedom Trail. So it's definitely an organization and a congregation that is relying on really robust and collaborative partnerships.
Yeah, that's great. So back at the very beginning of our conversation, you talked about Old North being famous for 1 minute in its history. So let's talk about that 1 minute. As many of our listeners might remember, Longfellow's poem about the Midnight Ride said that lanterns would be hung in the North Church Tower. That was his phrasing, was North Church.
It wasn't old yet.
Yeah. One if by land, and two if by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be. That version of the story is the one that most people know, if they know the story. But can you tell us what was really going on with the lanterns to the best of historians' understanding?
Yeah. So I think there are two common misconceptions that our visitors come with about the lantern story. And we can't fault them for it, because this is the myth of the lanterns. So first, there is this belief that the lantern signals were to Revere.
Right.
And I have seen families have very heated debates about, where was Revere when he got the signal? And I've been able to say, well, the good news is that you can mend this rift because you're all wrong.
Yeah.
But we know that the signal was from Revere, and that this was really, I would say, an insurance policy that he set in place for himself, so that if he was detained or captured or worse in the crossing across the river, that information would still be transported by light to Charlestown. And then we also, I think, see a common misconception that the lanterns hung all night, and that, they were seen in all directions by all people and understood. And it's like, well, this was an act of treason. This was, even though it was publicly seen, it was really a secret signal.
Right. And you don't tell more people than you need to tell.
You don't. You don't. And we think that it was up for really just about a minute, that it was up and down. And of course, we know that even then, by the time that those two lantern bearers made their way down, about 8 stories of stairs, that there are already soldiers at the doors to the church trying to get in and trying to figure out what's going on. And so I think it's actually a much more thrilling tale than people give it credit for.
Yeah, absolutely. And can you tell us a little bit about the people who held the lanterns?
Yeah, so we believe that the lanterns were held by two men, Robert Newman, who was the church sexton, who would have had a key, and Captain John Pulling Jr., who was a vestryman, which if folks aren't familiar with that term, it basically means a lay leader in the church. And he was a sea captain. And so, maybe is one of those people whose opinions shifted as his wallet started to feel these policies. We don't know much about the prior relationship between the two of them. We don't know much about how they may have been connected to Revere. And yet, we actually have a curricula for elementary school students called History Mystery, in which they solve the mystery of who hung the lantern signals. And so in an effort to solve that mystery ourselves, this is what we believe to be true.
So we talked at the beginning about some of the ways that Old North Illuminated is uncovering and sharing pieces of the history that are not just that 1 minute and talking about the diverse stories. Are there any particular stories or kind of categories of story that have been uncovered in this research and in this reinterpretation that you're particularly excited about or that you want to share?
So our interpretation is guided by an interpretive plan that we developed in 2022. And I do want to give kudos to our consultants, Kristen Gallus and Nicole Moore, who helped really bring that plan to life. And, we were very intentional about articulating themes and topics and questions that would span all of Old North's history. So, for example, thinking about the paradox of revolutions, the fact that revolution does tend to leave some people behind. We talked about the evolving American identity. What does it mean to be an American? What is the power of artists as activists? And I think Revere himself was an artist and activist. I don't know if he would have called himself that, but I do, because I think it's true.
Yeah.
And so that has really given us a framework to expand the stories. I just have to say again how much Dr. Crumley's research has really changed the way we think about ourselves. And really our goal is for all Americans to see themselves reflected in places of prominence like Old North, like the Paul Revere House. One of the stories that came out of Dr. Crumley's research that I think is particularly powerful and relevant today is the story of a congregant named Beulah Speen. And Beulah appears in archival records at Old North and some other institutions at several points throughout her life. And we believe that she was a Nipmuc woman and possibly Afro-Indigenous. But what's interesting is that her birth record does not indicate a race. And so that would indicate that most likely the person is white, because people of the past are very concerned about race and, power and hierarchy and structure. But
and they didn't think of white as being a race. They thought of it as the absence
as the norm,
right.
So you'll note if someone is other.
Right.
And she was not othered in her birth record. But when she first appears in records at Old North, it is indicated that she is biracial. And, that's not a term that they would have used at that time. I can't remember the exact phrasing, but that's the implication. And so that's interesting. But then at the time of her marriage, when, notably she is marrying a black man, then her race is indicated as black. And her children are noted as being black. And so we don't know if Beulah's identity changed, if the way she saw herself changed over time. But we certainly can see that the way other people saw her changed over time.
Yeah.
And that there were important notations and corrections and changes, if you will, made in those archival entries.
Yeah.
And I think that that's really important to see, because so much of the pushback that we're seeing, like right now in real time about DEI efforts, is how race is this new thing that people are now concerned about. And it's like identity politics. And it's, it's like, well, I think this story shows that race really is a social construct. It's really about power and hierarchy. And it's so clear when we see
fluid.
Yeah.
And Jamie Crumley also did a lecture for the Paul Revere House lecture series in partnership with Old North last fall, I believe. So I'll link to that in our show notes if you want to hear more about her research.
Another thing that I'm excited about is a new exhibit that we're going to be unveiling in just a few months in May. It's a archaeology exhibit that we're doing in partnership with the City of Boston Archaeology Department. And it's going to be looking at the lives of real children who lived in the North End and were connected to Old North over time, beginning with the early 18th century and going into the early 20th century.
Nice.
And so it will be looking at particularly some tales of immigration and, how that experience of childhood has changed or maybe not changed over time. And I think that's a great example of a story that we can tell that is powerful and significant and relevant to Old North, but is not about Paul Revere and the Lantern Signals.
Right. And for listeners who aren't familiar with a lot of North End history, this has been really a newcomer neighborhood for much of its history, especially in the 19th century, but also at other times. So there are many different immigrant stories that can be told because we've had many waves of immigration where the North End is where people were living. Before we close, is there anything that I didn't ask you or that you didn't bring up that you want to make sure that we cover?
I guess in closing, I just want to give a plug to especially local listeners to really get out in this anniversary year, take advantage of your location, go to all the historic sites you went to in 5th grade and give them a fresh look. Yeah. Because if I look at what we're doing at Old North, at the Revere House, at the other Freedom Trail sites, national parks, everybody is doing new and exciting things.
Yeah.
We are open for the season. We are open right now Tuesday through Sunday. Our hours are available on oldnorth.com. And I hope folks will come see us and that they'll come see you as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today, Nikki.
Thank you for having me.
We just heard from Nikki Stewart, Executive Director of Old North Illuminated. Now, listeners, if you'll follow me, we'll step into the Paul Revere House for our next segment, our favorite questions.
So welcome back, everybody, to the Favorite Questions segment. Want to introduce yourself?
My name is Corbin Young. I'm a historical interpreter here at the Paul Revere House. I've been here for about a year. I believe October of last year is when I started.
Same, yeah. So we're here to talk about the kind of questions and interactions we have here at the museum on a daily basis. So what is your kind of favorite question that you get asked pretty regularly?
I think my favorite question that we get asked regularly is just generally about ghosts. People seem to be, I think people, when they come to a museum, especially when it's a house museum and it has so much history attached to it, people every now and then will be like, well, have you ever seen anything? Anything ever gone on? Yeah, spooky wise. Especially if they're coming from the ghost tour down the street. Or maybe they're here to see Salem.
In October, November, it's like almost every day you're getting that question.
Absolutely.
Multiple times.
They're usually wearing some Salem.
Yes.
They even have a little witch hat on.
Yeah, a lot of people come with a witch hat.
Immediately coming over from Salem. And I think it's always good because everybody gets a little bit disappointed when you're like, well, no.
Well, no, I don't believe in ghosts.
I don't actually believe in ghosts personally, and I haven't seen anything too crazy. But it is always a really great moment to kind of remind people that there were no witches in Salem, and that there was a lot of other, systematic problems going on besides, communions with the devil.
Right.
Which is always a little disappointing to some people, but it can be really eye-opening, and I think it's important to a lot of people. They're really receptive.
Well, because you kind of make them think about the real aspect of it and not just the kind of fairy tale.
Yeah, absolutely.
I always like to say, well, because so many people lived here, definitely a lot of people have passed away in the house, you can try to get them to start to think about just how frequently death would be occurring, especially at home.
Exactly. You talk about Paul's, children who pass away.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of them died in that house.
And they're immediately like, oh, well, there must be some child ghosts running around. And it's like, well, we haven't seen any.
Right.
Not yet.
Okay, so what is kind of the question that is one that sticks out in your head, or something that's your favorite question you've been asked?
My favorite question that kind of sticks out in my head right now is I always really like it when somebody comes in, especially if it's like a little kid who you wouldn't expect to know really much about the revolution in general.
Right.
And then they start asking you questions. I had a little boy come in and he asked me a lot of questions about Paul Revere's ride. And he asked me a lot about the sort of fables that came up around it, where he said, he's like, oh, well, is it true that his dog got his spurs for him? And I was like, no, actually, it's not true that happened. He was very disappointed. And then he asked about asking for a lady's, he said dress, but he was like, he asked for a lady's dress to wrap around his oars so he could make his way across the river. I was like,
oh yeah, I've heard that one.
Yeah, I was like, that didn't actually happen. And he was a little disappointed. And then he literally hits me with so I guess that Sam Adams and John Hancock didn't have like a full salmon, just like, and I was like, that's a really niche...
Where are you hearing this?
Yeah, I was like, that's a really niche thing that you heard about, but that actually is something that happened.
Yeah.
That happened, and he was very excited. I looked at his parents, and his parents had no idea how he knew that information. He's just really into it, I suppose.
Yeah, a little enthusiast.
It was awesome.
It is kind of fun, though, because, just because Paul Revere is such a, folk tale guy at this point, that there are a lot of misconceptions. People walk in thinking that the Midnight Ride never even occurred, or all of it's a lie. So it is kind of fun sometimes to be able to pick through the real facts.
Absolutely. I always try to tell people that because of the time period between Paul and people caring about Paul as a historical figure, just leaves so much room for him to become a folk figure.
Right.
He's like a Johnny Appleseed kind of thing.
He kind of is. He would not have been famous when he was alive, and it was a pretty substantial amount of time. A lot of things changed. Right. It left a lot of time for him to become this weird figure. Okay, and so to close out, what is something that you wish visitors would ask you more consistently?
I think a lot of people come into the Revere house, and completely understandably so, asking a lot of questions about Paul Revere and really going gung-ho on Paul Revere, which is great, and we love that. But it's also really interesting that the house, in a lot of ways, is barely Paul Revere's house. It was only his house for 30 years, And so, I personally enjoy a lot when people talk about pre-Paul Revere, when people are interested in what was going on in this house before Paul Revere. I really like it when people ask me questions about Puritanism and Puritans' ideas of Christmas and what that meant and all of that. So I think that in a broad sense, just questions about sort of the earliest parts of the settlement.
I think it's really interesting because it is a very different world to the one that Paul Revere lived in. People were doing very different things. They behaved differently.
The land was more cultivated. It was more, there's roads built to more places.
Right.
Whereas this early Puritan time period is this age of fear and
and they were pretty intense people.
Exactly, right? It's almost medieval. I always try to tell people too, to kind of put it into perspective, where 40 years before the birth of Paul Revere, they're killing people in Salem for witchcraft.
Right.
And then 40 years after the death of Paul Revere is the American Civil War.
Right.
You know what I mean? So the house, there for all of it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
There's just such an interesting
It's a window into many different periods and many different kinds of people and many different ways of just viewing the world in and of itself. Well, thank you very much for talking with me.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for everybody for listening, and we will see you next time.
Thank you for tuning in to Revere House Radio. I'm your host, Tegan Kehoe, and I am the Research and Adult Program Director here at the Paul Revere House. Our production team for this season includes Derek Hunter, Mahitabel Glenhaber, Katie Stefani, and Adrienne Turnbull-Riley. If you're listening online, we encourage you to subscribe in your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. Revere House Radio is a production of the Paul Revere Memorial Association, the nonprofit which operates the Paul Revere House Museum. You can find more information, subscribe to our mailing list or social media, or become a member on our website at www.paulreverehouse.org, or come visit us in Boston.